Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another Sunday School Teacher Workshop. And this week, moving right along in our unit progression, second lesson of the unit, we are in Acts 22 and 23. And I'm sure if you've looked ahead, you've probably seen already this. We're dotting the map throughout most of these chapters pretty hard and heavy. And the reason why is because after we get past lesson 5, in this second or middle unit, we're done with the book of Acts. And then we get that last and final Sunday in this unit. And then the final 3 lessons are going to be on the book of Revelation. So with quicker pace, it kind of forces us to talk about a bit more material. But then again, a lot of what's going on in this is largely narrative. But that's part of the challenge that I'm giving you as goes trying to pump the brakes just a little bit as you're both studying and preparing to teach your students. And of course, as you teach your students, because Luke's interest, considering he's writing both a gospel and a follow-on companion to talk about how the gospel itself, not just the message, but the reality of its permeating the world with the entire message. As you've heard me say so many times before, the gospel message, according to the gospel writers, echoing Jesus' own words, is not just encapsulating the idea that Christ died to save sinners. It's a pronouncement that the kingdom of God has arrived, and its king in the person of Christ, God manifested in human flesh, is here to rule and reign and unite heaven and earth, establishing God's authority over the cosmos, and he being the nexus point between the two. And he is ruling, and all enemies are going to be subjected under his feet until the final enemy is subjected, and of course that's death. And as he's making all things new, it's starting first in a reverse fashion with humans rather than us being the final act of the first creation, and we're the first act of the new creation until he comes and finishes that off as he will rule and reign amongst us physically. That's so important for us to grasp. We can never lose sight of that in the progression of the New Testament narrative, including through all this narrative material. Of course, he's going to be falsely accused. He's going to be apprehended. He's going to be placed in chains. He's going to go through a kangaroo court mock trial of sorts that's really more or less to mock him. It's not mock in the sense it's false. And then eventually he's going to wind up in Rome. And when he makes it to Rome, we hear the end of the story that he's still proclaiming of God to all house arrest. What's the point of us following this progressive course to just see how Paul's journey ends? There's so much more to it than just those narratives. As goes Paul the map, Jerusalem to Sicily, across the Mediterranean, and to Rome. So I could talk more about this, but I don't want to use all of my time, but I do want to at least drop this one final thing in here before I finally get into our material tonight. One thing I think it's very important for us to make sure we're still maintaining good focus on as we're now almost to the end of this book. We're not just deep in it, we're almost at the conclusion of it. Is the simple fact that Luke, among the many, many themes that he's embedded for us, one of those being the fruition of what Jesus said in front of Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin when he said, "From now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven." Coming on the clouds meaning ascending. So forecasting the fact that he will not just simply die and go away. He will die, but when he does, he will be resurrected, and then he will ascend to the right hand of the Father. He will fulfill the vision of Daniel chapter 7. He will receive a kingdom. He's ruling over that kingdom and has been for 2,000 years. But they would see signs in their own generation, and that is one of the big substances of the book of Acts. The fact that Jesus has indeed ascended to the right hand of the Ancient of Days and received the throne of his father David and is ruling is his. That's a big, big pinnacle theme. But another theme that runs somewhat sub to that is watching how the disciples of Jesus are all called and commissioned to repeat the journey of Jesus. Now, when I say that, I don't mean we need to go follow in the footsteps of Christ from the Jordan, then out into the wilderness, up to Galilee, and then back down into Judea, make a stand in Jerusalem, and then from there, we just go to our own place. What I mean by that is our submission to the Father's agenda, and that, of course, is calling out a people who are meant to fulfill the Abrahamic blessing of Genesis 12, changing the world. Jesus inaugurated that mission, but he made it clear to his disciples he is passing that on to them. And we've seen this grow from a tiny flickering flame to something of a raging bonfire as these stories have went from smaller to larger. Let me qualify that statement a little deeper. Early on in Acts chapter 7 and 8, we were introduced to this man who was called Stephen and brought in to be one of the 7 that was supposed to try to help guide the community of believers in solving this big dispute that arose between the Hebrew-speaking and the Greek-speaking Jews, right? And then, of course, he gets falsely accused in front of the Sanhedrin, the exact same way Christ does. But then he preaches a sermon to these people that outright indicts them for being the ones who are guilty of breaking God's covenant commandments, and they are the ones that are ultimately transgressing, receiving an invitation to come into God. In front of the Sanhedrin. He's lambasting them for being the ones who are ultimately guilty of crimes against God, crimes of high treason against the King of Heaven. Last thing he says, looking up into heaven before he commits himself unto Jesus, is that he sees the Son of Man seated at the right, or standing at the right hand. Into your hands I commit my spirit. It's just a small segment, right? Eventually we get to Peter, and Peter's story is largely the same when you consider that incident where he's locked up alongside James, the brother of John. James is beheaded, and of course we know Peter is destined for the same thing, if not for the fact that the Lord rescued him, and through that... Oh, it's not? Okay. Sorry about that. No, it's okay. Sorry about that. We had some spotty coverage, and thankfully Richard came down here to save us. So, as I was saying, Peter was rescued, unlike Jesus, who actually had to go through the full diorama of the cross. But there are some subtle details between those two stories that track Peter on top of Jesus' own story, because both of these happened during the days of unleavened bread. And in a sense, as Peter is under a death sentence, he is consigned to death, but rescued, which is almost like a resurrection event of his own, to then go and tell the disciples about his resurrection. The first people that both Peter and Jesus meet are females, and they are the ones to carry the message to other disciples that both Jesus is alive, Peter has been rescued from jail. These are not to make men like Stephen and Peter on par with Jesus. What this is meant to do, though, is to show us that our journey as disciples is meant to mimic that of Christ's. We surrender to the death that we must die, that Jesus forecast for all of us when he was speaking in John 12. Except for a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die, it cannot produce the fruit it's intended to. Now we have the story of Paul through the rest of the book of Acts, and it's a far greater exaggeration of this. As goes the fact, when we are at this point in the story, we are seeing Paul, again, as I opened this up with, being falsely accused and so on. So, the reason why these things are important for us is because if we fail to capture this, then we're not going to understand what's the main thrust of why Paul or Luke is even writing this tractate to go along with his volume of the gospel. It's to help make sure that we understand the enduring message to all Christians is that we follow the submission that Jesus gave himself over to in order to accomplish the Father's will, so that we continue to, quote, die, and by virtue of that, produce the fruit that we're meant to. Now, that's a big sub-theme. another sub-theme that's going on here is the fact that as this kingdom has come crashing into human existence, we're looking at the fulfillment of many Old Testament prophecies that are not directly quoted or even alluded to in many ways by Luke as he's writing this volume. One of those happens to be, and I'm drawing our attention now to this middle orange block, that Paul is a symbolically renewed Israel. So one thing we need to capture here is that Israel was meant to be renewed. And of the many different places I could point you to, I'm going to point you to Isaiah chapters 42 and 43, where God speaks of Israel as being both a blind and servant, but he commits himself to Israel to rescue them from the captivity of their exile, and by virtue of that, even though they have been blind and deaf for the duration of their relationship with Yahweh, yet he is going to take this blind and deaf servant and send them to the nations so they can first testify to all nations of God's enduring love and mercy, and that he is inviting all nations now to join in with Israel as part of his covenant people. So Paul, being a member of the nation of Israel, remember he tells the Philippians, he's a Hebrew of the Hebrews, born of the tribe of Benjamin and so on, that Paul, as a symbol of this renewed Israel, is going forth to reach the promised land. Now, when I say promised land, I'm hoping that you're tracking with me the story of the Old Testament. Israel, locked up in Egypt, God sends the deliverer, and by virtue of that, exile ends, Exodus begins, and he is sending them to the land of their inheritance. When they enter into Canaan, they are meant to conquer it, and by virtue of that, when they take it over, it's not for them to just simply squat there and enjoy the abundance of the land. They have a mission that's been hundreds of years in the making, generations from Abraham now to the great-great-grandchildren of the 12 patriarchal heads of the tribes of Israel. Their job now as a mighty nation is to go and begin the process of drawing the nations back in unto right relationship with Yahweh as a full kingdom of priests unto the nations. Well, we saw how over 1,000 years they flubbed that up miserably, and God, through another exile, an exodus that happened during the days of the Assyrians and Babylonians, stretching on past the time of the Persians, Greeks, and Romans, are now, or is now, bringing about this renewal effort. So the promised land is not Canaan. The promised land is the globe. Jesus is not geographically interested in Israel. He makes this abundantly clear in more than one place. He starts this out for us in the first canonical gospel in Matthew when he tells them, as he sends out the 12 two by two, you won't finish going to all these towns before I return, talking about his judgment that will come prophesied in Matthew 24. But also paralleling that with John's gospel, he tells them, or I should say, he tells first the woman at the well that God is not interested in having people come to either Jerusalem or the sacred mountain that exists by the well of Jacob for people to go and worship. Rather, they will worship everywhere, and as they worship, they will worship God in spirit and truth, fulfilling the words of the ancient prophet Micah, chapter 1, verse 11, that everywhere incense and offering will be offered unto Yahweh. So now, the focus on the promised land is the nations. And Yahweh spoke of it, and if Paul will simply trust himself to Yahweh's will, then this is exactly what God is going to do through Paul. Now, what I intend to do through these two columns on the left and right side of the screen is parallel this story of Paul with the story of Balaam and Balak. Now, I have no idea whether or not Luke had any intent to do this whatsoever. But the reason why I bring up this Old Testament story of Exodus, exile, all that, is when we move past the moment when Israel leaves Egypt, and now they are, after they've left Mount Sinai, they are wandering around in the wilderness. Eventually, they start creeping up on the eastern border of the Jordan River. And when they do that, they have to go through the land of Moab. The king of Moab, Balak at the time, sees the immense threat that these hundreds of thousands strong soldiers are to them, and he wants Balaam to curse them. Balaam happens to be a prophet, a soothsayer of sorts in the ancient world, and apparently he has cultic power available through his power of speech and the various wiles that he uses to effect curses, which there's a whole separate conversation about ancient curses. We're not going to endure that tonight, but I will say that obviously there was some merit to this. But when Balaam comes, we know how this story goes. Through the moment of the talking donkey and eventually into Balak's presence, he eventually utters 4 oracles in which he does nothing but bless Israel. Now, you might wonder, how in the world does that have anything to do with what's going on in Paul's life? I'm not saying you have to parallel these two stories together in order to understand what Luke is saying about Paul. But if we have, from the beginning of my conversation up until now, understood these meta-narrative principles of Scripture, we see that the story that God had forecasted with what he was doing with Israel in Egypt is the exact thing he's doing now, but in a sense, it's on a global scale. It's not just one nation coming out of exile to go into a geographic, isolated spot for them to start to thrive as a nation to then reach the world. God has ignited the final Exodus through the final Moses and Joshua, that being his own son, the Christ, to then take his called out people that he is not raising up from just one geographic area, but through those people from that geographic area, sending them out as missionaries to the nations, to then raise up other ethnic brothers and sisters, Jews from the synagogues they'll preach at, along with Gentiles, to effectively work about this change of bringing the kingdom into existence everywhere they go. So, when we go to the Old Testament story of Balak, king of Moab, seeing Israel as the terrible threat he perceived them to be and the action he took against them, we start to see something very similar going on here with respect to the story of Paul. Paul walks into Jerusalem and has done absolutely nothing wrong. Just as much as Israel has wandered out into the wilderness because that's where the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night has led them. They have run no foul against Moab whatsoever. They did not come in as some conquering horde to go smash down the walls of villages and towns and to just destroy all the men, kidnap women and children and make them slaves, and then spoil everything that they could find and make it their own. In fact, God made it very clear, because Moab is a distant relation to them, they are not to treat them in such a way. Balak is the one who wants to pick the fight, much in the same way these Asiatic Jews who have also made pilgrimage to Jerusalem see Paul here in the temple courts, and they want to pick a fight with him. And so the parallel continues to develop. So we're going to go back and forth on both from left to right. And then with that, I hope this begins to materialize effectively. And what I want you to understand in this is, again, the end result, which is that orange block in the center of the screen. Because the end of the story happens to be that no matter what Balak tries to do, Balaam is completely constrained and cannot do anything but bless Israel. And no matter what these Jews who want to annihilate Paul try to do, God is going to continue to protect Paul. And it's not just to speak of God's provision in protecting his people. It's for the end outcome. God is protecting Israel in the wilderness because, as Balaam prophesied, through them, the heads of the nations will be crushed and subdued. Through them, a star will rise. A king will ascend to command the obedience of the nations, not just Moab. And salvation will come through these people. And ultimately, that's what's going to happen with Paul. Paul is going to continue his emissary journey beyond the shores of Israel, all the way up into Nero's palace. And while he's there, the book of Acts will conclude with him witnessing, sharing the gospel, the proclamation that a new king reigns who does not descend from the line of the Julians, i.e. the Caesars, that have reigned from Julius up until Nero. Instead, the one true king who made both heaven and earth, and whose kingdom is now coming to domineer and dominate human history. And no matter what human agents might try to do, even if they're successful in lopping off the head of someone like Paul, yet this mission will continue onward. So, first purple block, Israel in the wilderness, Balak and Balaam attack. So in Numbers 22, we have Balak saying to Balaam, "Look, a people has come out of Egypt. They come to cover the surface of the land and are living right across from me. Please come and put a curse on these people for me, because they are more powerful than I am." Now, A very similar phrase is what we find in Acts 21. Some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul in the temple, and they're all shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people, our law, and this place." Notice in the way that they phrase this man in their sight is not just a heretic, he is a grave threat to their people, because they recognize the fact he has made numerous journeys all throughout the continent of Europe and has told Jews in synagogues everywhere he is that apparently they are not to be worshiping the Lord according to the law of Moses anymore. He's speaking not only against the law, but is even teaching them contradictory commands according to what the law clearly states. Of course, he's most likely doing exactly what Jesus did and undermining the traditions from the scribes and elders that have been passed down from the centuries of Ezra all the way up until this time. That being said, while they're twisting the truth, as they phrase it this way, everybody clearly got the message because everyone seems to respond immediately. They go on. What's more, he has also brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place, and that to them is, of course, anathema. Final straw, he's worthy of death. So again, in both of these, we see that Israel in the eyes of Balak is a grave threat, Paul in the eyes of these Asiatic Jews, and now these Hebraic Jews in Jerusalem is a grave threat that must be dealt with. Back to Balak. Balak wants nothing more but nothing less than Israel's total annihilation. He says, "Come now and put a curse on them for me. I may be able to fight against them and drive them away." Drive them away is an optimal outcome, but a far more ideal one would be that he just crushes them now in the wilderness so that they will never arise to be a threat against him again. This is exactly what these Jews want. They raise their voices shouting, "Wipe this man off the face of the earth. He should not be allowed to live." Now, back to Balak. So at the time, Balak is attempting to try to do the one thing he knows works with the gods, Chemosh, that he worships amongst the pantheon, Chemosh being their chief god, much as Baal is amongst the Canaanite pantheon within the land that will become Israel in the not too distant future. So Balaam is summoning Balak to bring forth these cultic measures, as goes building altars and sacrificing animals, so through the practice that he's the expert at, he can divine the will of God, and by virtue of that, use this as a way to manipulate their God against Israel by finding some way to make him dissatisfied with them or bind him in some sort of occultic way to make sure that he destroys Israel or at least removes his favor from them. So Balak sacrificed his cattle, sheep, and goats, and he sends for Balaam and the officials who were with him. And in the morning, Balak took Balaam and brought him to Bamoth Baal, and more sacrifices ensue after this. And ironically enough, where do we find Paul at the moment this story is actually transpiring? He's in the temple, and what is happening in the temple from sunup to sundown? Literally, the first thing that occurs at first light in the morning is that a lamb has to be given as a burnt offering until the last light when another lamb is given as a burnt offering. Now, it might seem somewhat coincidental, and truly, what's happening in the temple here is not that anyone is offering sacrifices to find a way for Yahweh to remove his favor from Paul. It's just the fact that in the background of what's happening here, we have cultic practices with the sacrificing of animals, so it definitely draws a closer parallel between these stories. Because the reason why those Israelites are in the temple is they are offering sacrifices, whether it's fellowship or burnt offerings, thanksgiving offerings, you name it, for the sake of trying to garner Yahweh's continued favor over them. And certainly, as the crowd is now stirred against Paul with the musings of these Asiatic Jews who are shouting accusations against them, they feel they must act, else if they allow this heretic to live, that will be the means by which God will remove his favor from them. So now we have a plot that's hatched. Balaam will ultimately wind up weakening Israel so that God will seek to destroy them. So we know in the story of Numbers, Balaam is unsuccessful. He blesses Israel 4 total times and continues to retort to Balak, who is now absolutely angry and as frustrated can be that Balaam continues to bless. In fact, he just implores Balaam to stop speaking so that he will no longer bless them if he can't truly curse them. But the story doesn't end there. It doesn't go on to say that Balaam orchestrated the plan that follows with the cultic sexual practices that the men of Israel will then engage in with the Midianite women that causes plague to ravage the camp. But we understand from the words of Joshua just a few books later, this is what he says as he's recounting their history. Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab, set out to fight against Israel. And he sent for Balaam, son of Beor, to curse you. But I would not listen to Balaam. Instead, he himself blessed you, and I rescued you from him. So, rescued you from who? From Balak or from Balaam? The truth is both. And as we also will read in the book of Deuteronomy, Balaam was put to the sword. And why? Because Balaam was apparently the chief architect behind enticing the men of Israel, since he could not curse them for the money that Balak offered, to then go out and see the women doing whatever it was they do as they offer their sacrifices to entice men to come and pay the money, make the sacrifice, and engorge themselves with sexual expression with these women. So again, a plan hatched by Balaam and Balak to ultimately try to seduce Israel, and they are successful. And God indeed does bring plague because of his dissatisfaction. We go to this story, a plan is hatched. 40 Israelites decide that they will not allow food to touch their lips until Paul is dead. And ultimately, as Jesus said regarding his own disciples, they thought that they were doing God a favor in this. And how does this story wind up ending? We go back to Balak and Balaam, and we see that through the mouth of a Gentile, God ultimately preserves, protects, rescues his own people. Numbers 23. Balak asked to Balaam, "What have you done to me?" And Balaam says, Balak, "I brought you to curse my enemies, but look, you have only blessed them." He answered, "Shouldn't I say exactly what the Lord puts in my mouth?" How does the story end for Paul? By the hand of a Gentile, Paul is protected. In Acts 23, we read this. He summoned 2 of the centurions and said, "Get 200 soldiers ready with 70 cavalry and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Also provide mounts to ride so that Paul may be brought safely to Felix the governor." So that ultimately this plan concocted by these Jews will not be successful. So I know when you read this with me, it might seem a little bit difficult to line these details up. I'm not saying it's a perfect one-for-one. And again, I'm not saying it's necessary to isolate the story of Balak and Balaam, parallel it against this of what's going on with Paul to make Paul's story make sense. But what I will do in summing this up is simply say, if watching the story of Israel in the Old Testament and how God starts things out from the moment they leave Egypt until the end of their kingdom at the hands of the Babylonians, it starts off wonderful, but it ends in horrific tragedy. But we see the inverse of this from the time that Christ comes on the scene. He is redeeming Israel's broken history to make sure that they fulfill the mission that God gave them. The only possible way this could happen would be through the words of what the ancient prophets said would come. Guys like Isaiah, amongst so many more who were prophesying that through the calamity of the captivity that God will bring about, starting with the Assyrians and Babylonians, he is going to ultimately refine his people through this crucible. He will burn away the dross, he will get rid of the chaff, and he will make sure that they are a people prepared and ready for the arrival of himself. This happens in the days of John the Baptist. The final Exodus begins. This has been the launch of the final Exodus through Jesus, and now we're reaching the pinnacle moment where the nations are being brought into this. So when we look at the story of the Old Testament and what God is doing in the wilderness with his people, Satan is working. Satan is doing his best to try to use people like Balak and Balaam to thwart his people, to try to find a means of subverting them before they can ever make it into the land. Because once they make it to the land, if they are successful in being obedient to God's covenant, they will change the world. No doubt Satan's aware of this. So what is he trying to do here and now? He's trying to stir up those people who think they serve God by trying to get others stirred up along with them to silence a servant like Paul by having him executed. But in both instances, we see those conspirators put down, and God ultimately winds up bringing his people into the promised land, Israel into the land of Canaan, to destroy the wicked inhabitants that were there, and to ultimately set up a kingdom that for a time was but a brief glimpse of how this world-changing mission was going to work under David when he's subduing Moab, Edom, and Ammon, and so forth. But now we have the full picture of this as Paul is being brought into the new promised land, which again, geographically, not Israel, but Rome. Not that Rome is significant in any other way other than the fact she's the capital of the empire that's currently ruling over Israel, stewarding that nation, and all the nations that Paul and others have went to share the gospel. And before the end of this, both Rome and the rest of its empire will be conquered before Paul and these other disciples wind up closing their eyes in death. All right, so with that, any thoughts, any questions on this before we end our time together?